Okay.
To officially start us off, welcome everybody to the Undergraduate Research Education Series. Stephanie Shiver, or just Shiver, work obviously in the Office of Undergraduate Research. To start us off, I want to start with a pretty simple land acknowledgement, and then we'll get the rest of the program underway. So I took this land acknowledgement from Ella Blanchard and the Office of Inclusive Excellence, and I feel like give credit where credit is due. But the American Indian Resource Center leads the way for Ella and then me to acknowledge that the land that the University of Utah resides on has always been Indigenous land, specifically on the lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. It's also imperative that we acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. Through this land acknowledgement, I want to express gratitude and appreciation for their persevering to protect this land for future generations, and also to acknowledge that the erasure of this relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands is an insidious form of ongoing colonization. And we, especially as folks occupying this land right now, need to build our mindfulness around the erasure and other important Indigenous protocols. So I want to start off with that. And then again, I think another person or two have logged in. So welcome to the Undergraduate Research Education Series. If you have logged into the in real time event, your logging in counts as your education series attendance. You don't have to worry about that. I've got all that info. If you're watching the recorded version later, please fill out the evaluation sheet on the education series page. That's how I know that you watched the video. And otherwise, I cannot track that you did your attendance through the video. I think that's all of the kind of introductory housekeeping sort of things. So we're here today to talk about, and it really is a discussion-based session, but to talk about increasing diverse representation in research, some of the challenges, some of the variety of ways to think about what increasing diverse representation in research means. And our facilitator, speaker, presenter, Dr. Ofer Rog.
Hi. Thank you for the introduction. So I haven't participated in this forum before, so I've prepared a few slides, a few of them, mostly to introduce myself, and I see this introduction mostly as a opening of discussions around questions. So, I mean, feel free to ask me about any of these issues or their impact on my life or career or the intersection of them with my work, and I'm happy to discuss them. So I'm going to talk a tiny bit about how did I get here and what do I do here? Just again, mostly to supply material for questions, and I'm happy to discuss any of these issues as I mentioned. I'll talk a tiny bit about efforts in the classroom. I mean, it was sort of an interesting process for me to prepare or to think about this discussion, just because I guess it made me realize both what I do and a lot of what I don't do. So it's kind of like an interesting experience, and I hope it's going to kind of keep informing how I'm building into the future. And as I meant, and then some of you or some of the group, either here or not here, submitted some questions. So I did try to think a bit about them and perhaps rephrase them. Some of them were, I think, repeating a bit. So, but again, if anything is not covered, I'm happy to also just discuss on the fly additional questions that you have. So, so I'm going to start. And again, my details are here, and feel free to follow up with me in any kind of way in any one of these medium. So about me, I have this sort of generic map of the world to just chart my journey. As you could probably tell from my accent, I'm not from here. I grew up in Israel. When I went to university there, I did my undergrads and masters in Israel, and then I went to London to do my PhD, and I worked there with Julie Cooper, who is actually by now moved a couple of times, and she's actually not far from here in Denver. So I worked there on the regulation of the very ends of the chromosome. So this structure is called the telomeres. I won't really mention that anymore, just in case this is of interest. I did have a couple of slides of the work we actually do in the lab in case it's interesting. I then, as is common in biology, actually I don't, maybe I should, before I go on, just to kind of know how many of you are in the sciences or in biology. Is that a fair, would you mind just maybe a quick show of hands or something, just so I know I can then maybe skip or say things a bit differently. You're not linked to the College of Science, right? Or to biology? Are any of you interested in biology or have background in biology? All right, so no. Okay, so fine. I will keep going, but also feel free to turn your cameras, introduce yourself when you speak, just so I'll be able to know who am I talking to. So as is common in biology nowadays, you do your real PhD and then you do a postdoc, which started as a short residency type affair, but now became effectively another PhD that you do. So that's kind of like how training in biology has come to be. So what I did was switch question and switch model organisms. And I went to work with Abby Dernberg in UC Berkeley. And I was there for quite a while. And then I moved here late 2016. So it's really almost exactly 4 years ago. And I'm at the School of Biological Sciences. So I have a few, I would say, axes of, diversity here. And I don't know if this is exactly in the best or the most influential order on my career. But I would say all of these have probably had dramatic influences, both negative and positive, on my career, as would be probably the case for many people. So I'm, as I said, happy to go into any of these in particular if you have any questions. So just to kind of open the conversation. So so now I'm an assistant professor here. As I said, I've been here for 4 years. Some of the things that I do, and this is in a bit of the order of like kind of I would say importance for my progress, and also in the amount of time that is spent. So most of my time is spent managing an active research lab. We're now 8 people, including undergrads and grad students and postdoctoral researchers and technicians. I'm going to have a couple slides about what we actually do in the lab, but that is like raising funds, mentoring them, managing every aspect from space to personal relationships, or to, I would say, interpersonal relationships in the lab, to guiding people through their PhDs. That's kind of most of what I do. I teach, as this is sort of like common for people in my level, a full-on undergraduate course, which is advanced cell biology. I'm going to talk a bit about that. I'm also teach a graduate course. It's a course for graduate students focused on writing, scientific writing. So I'm very proud of this. It's one of my, I kind of created it, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. I do, as part of my job, what's called service, which means I sit on various committees and efforts like that. I would say my major focus, because I chose and because this is what I was assigned, was focused on graduate students. So both recruiting them and advising them and making sure they succeed, especially in their early stages. So when they just come into the program and they don't have like a home they have a lab, once they have a lab, they have a supervisor who takes a lot of the responsibility and mentorship roles. But I think in the very beginning, this transition tends to be hard for people. And I think we lose a lot of people who didn't necessarily come with the very exact, set of, preconditions, I would say, that are not, many times are unfairly arbitrary. So I think we're trying to, this is like a major place where I think we are working on our diversity efforts and increasing, like making the program really allow everybody who's putting in the effort and the work and has the brains to succeed, which I don't think this is where we are at, but this is where we'd like to be. And I'm also participating in faculty hiring, which is outside the scope of this, but I'm happy to talk about that if you have any questions. And definitely a place where we tend to hit a wall, I would say. Our efforts tend to fall flat. So I'm happy to talk about that. And then some of my, I would say, extracurricular work, I'm going to have a slide on this, but I've done some work on that's not part of my job description, on setting up this LGBTQ interest group in the College of Science. So I will mention that briefly, but happy to talk about that. So just a tiny 2 slides about my work, just so you know, because again, that's how I spend most of my time. So I'm mostly interested in, my lab is interested in how chromosomes work, how they move about, and how they carry out their function. The biological process we're focused on is called meiosis, and meiosis is the process by which we produce sperm and egg. So as of course you know, life begins where an organism is born, where you have the genetic component in a sperm and an egg merging together to form a zygote and an embryo and an organism. But of course, that cycle has to be closed. You have to somehow, half the size of the genome, so that then when you merge it, you're going to still end up with the same amount of chromosomes and genetic material. So this process is called meiosis. And we do it we do this work mostly in a tiny nematode called C. elegans. So you can barely see it. It's less than 1 millimeter long, but so this is an image from under microscope. What you see here is the head of the worm. This is this kind of pump type thing where the worm takes in, it eats bacteria. And then this is the gonad of the worm, so where meiosis takes place and when you produce eggs. So this is, by looking at this, we studied the process. So I think that's kind of all I'm going to say about this. So not to take too much of our time, I'm going to maybe even skip this. Just a second. All right, so I'll talk a bit about this few small things I do in class and some of the challenges about curriculum, since that was the topic. This is the undergraduate class that I teach. Some of the efforts in this class and some of the challenges, I think for me, is that I wanted, it's the upper division class, so it's mostly juniors and seniors, normally 30 to 40 people register. So I think it's hopefully a space that people can, I want them to sort of leave a bit the mentality of sitting in a 200 people space and be a number in a large system where you just kind of study from textbooks and memorize, and so I want a chance for people to really experiment a bit more. And so this is actually why I included that paragraph that I adapted from somebody else, where I think I want part of the course is students stepping up to the board in a normal year, or open up their camera on Zoom and present a part of a research paper. And this is a sort of a challenging exercise, just because these papers were not written as study materials. They were written by specialists for specialists. So, but I think this exercise of still trying to work through what's going on there is really important. And even if you're making mistakes, which are definitely expected. So that's sort of a big part of what I'm trying to do in the class. Again, when it came to sort of choosing papers, this is sort of one of the reflections I had while thinking about this. Our discussion today is sort of where I succeeded and not succeeded in modifying the curriculum, because that's a major challenge. Like, how do you pick papers that are, again, they're good teaching tools for people who are just stepping into a field. So you can't just go by, I don't know, how influential the paper was or how important was it in the movement. You need to also, the paper has to make some sense on its own, just because of the structure of the course, and then also have to try to have diversity of multiple axes of diversity there. It's been a mixed bag, I would say, of success. So I mean, there's definitely still dramatic overrepresentation of probably white American men overrepresented there, and that's, again, there's some things we're trying to work there, but I can't say that I've reached anything near whatever proper representation for any kind of other group. I have tried a few things. So one thing that I am trying to do is, so again, this is, for example, one of the challenges that we're facing is that in trying to make a lot of this so this is advanced cell biology. So we're really going pretty deep into biology. This is not superficial anymore. So one of the things I am trying to do to get people to bring the kind of what might feel like minutiae of the cell into societal relevance. I am, for example, trying to, if the finding or the data has been important, for example, in developing a new drug, or exactly, for example, it was linked to a Nobel Prize, I feel, or to some technological innovation that everybody knows about, I feel that's a useful way to engage students with the research. The caveat of that, of course, is that if you're only limited yourself to Nobel Prizes, you're mostly going to show a picture of white men. And that's the reality. This is sort of like, I would say, one of the few exceptions when the Nobel Prize given for this particular discovery was actually done by women, but that's definitely the exception more than the rule. These are maybe a few of the exceptions, so maybe underrepresentative. The other things that I think you could do along the way is, so one of the, maybe I should go to the previous slide. Any questions so far? Sorry, I can kind of keep talking, but all right. So I half done, I think, with the slides I have, or more than half. But one of the things in biology, there's like a bit of the way papers are written, because of the lab format, papers don't just have a single author. So it's not like a book or something in humanities, say. So there's a kind of complicated, or I would say elaborate hierarchy of names. So for example, in a paper, you'd have the last name, which is usually the person getting the credit. This is the person whose lab this research was done in. This is actually and then there's the first person, who tends to be the trainee who did the work. That's kind of like the hierarchy. And as you could imagine, if you're going to focus on the last names, you're going to have more white men than if you're going to focus on the first name. So one thing that I am trying to do is, for example, put pictures of people who've done the work. And I think that has sometimes, especially again, if you have a more of a fair representation of the actual people who did the work, you can slightly increase some of the representation, even if the papers are still, there's an uneven contributions there. This is another example where I think the Nobel Prize was given to 3 men, but I feel like these other 2 scientists should definitely be given credit for some contribution without getting too much into a very controversy about who deserved it. It's clear that they have made significant contributions to this field. So you can, including them as well, I think is important. All right, I did mention this. Happy to talk about this. This is like a group we established with some trainees in the school and some other people in the College of Science. And in normal times, we'd had more social meetings. We've got some funding, and we're having outside speakers. So for example, 2 of the speakers in the School of Biological Science seminar series, they're part of the seminar series, but they're invited and hosted by us. So we had the person last week, and I think that's a great way to increase visibility, and that's, I think, has been going great for us. So I'm proud of that. I'm happy to talk about that. So that's the part of like introducing myself and what I do. And then next, I have a few questions from the list that you send me. So I'm happy to go through them, or if you have questions so far, anything about anything I've said, or something you want me to elaborate on.
I'm just trying to make sure I can see all of the things at once. So if anybody's like raising their hand or putting something in the chat,
Okay.
I don't think anybody said anything.
Okay, I did not hear anything, but yeah, it's good to hear you to make sure that if somebody said something, I could hear it. So I'll discuss a few of these questions, and hopefully that's going to be enough of a discussion. Or that's going to, you know, starts discussion. So the one question was how to bring up a question of increasing diversity to faculty in a respectful way. I think that question repeated itself multiple times in various, so this here means increasing the diversity of the curriculum. That's the this in this question referring to. So that's a difficult one. So I would say maybe rather than answering this, I'm going to tell you likely how this is going to play out. And this is not just necessarily from discussions, you know, with specific professors about these questions, but with general discussions that I've heard versions of it. And usually what I feel happens in response to this, and I've noticed this a lot, is a common response is to establish some false dichotomy between diversity, say, and seemingly objective measures. For example, you'd want to, you know, include another paper, and people are just going to tell you, well, you know, it doesn't meet our standards for excellent. It's not like I just told you right now. It's a great paper, but it's not a great teaching tool, or it's a great paper, but just not a fit for our course, or it's a great candidate for the job, but it's just not a good fit for our department. And I think these are some of the words that people might be using. And I think that's a common way these discussions are going in my experience. I'm not trying to say I've never been on both sides of this discussion. So I've definitely found myself in both sides of this discussion. It's one of the ironies of these efforts. So I think a real issue is, how could you fight this trend? How could we rephrase the conversation in a way that's going to be more you know, beneficial for us and more productive? That's not, I don't have a real answer. I would say something. So one thing that could be used is that I think the shape-shifting of, and by shape-shifting, I mean that people sometimes are going to exchange what's familiar to us with excellence or fit, or they're going to use these words as placeholders for something else that sometimes is less pleasant to say. Like they're not friendly. Like what was the one that I think this happened before I came to the department, is a story about like whatever, this is not somebody I'd want to, you know, sit around and have a beer with type comment that again, this before my time, but I have heard it. So when these things are sort of really a stand-in, so you're going to use fit or merit or excellence, but this really what you mean is something that you're just not embarrassed to say. So one thing I think could be said, and this is true for syllabi, is that I think using the word diversify could be a bit of it's going to raise resistance. But for example, asking to modernize a syllabus, for example, meaning to include more recent papers, is a good way to help these efforts. Because if you're just by doing that, for example, if in my course, if I shift from paper from the 80s to papers from the 2010s, my chance of having a senior female authors, for example, is going to be much greater. That's just statistics, because there has been some progress from the 80s till now. It's far from where we need to be, but there has been some progress. So I think sometimes asking people to just move in with the time has, even that's by itself, a bit of a benefit. That's not a solution. You can also come up with a very non-diverse syllabus, all from papers from the last month or year or decade. But if you are going to limit yourself to the 50s or the 60s or the 80s, it's going to be way easier to do. So that's, I would say, one thing. The other thing is is in these discussions, and again, this is challenging, and this is not something I would suggest for an undergrad talking to a professor, but it is worth knowing that a lot of these facts are it's worth knowing, like knowing how fit is being used in a very non-fair way, how diversity is in fact a key aspect to increasing excellence, how, for example, immigrants tend to, they publish more for their, on average, how any kind of merit argument usually, and this goes from anywhere between the GRE or, scoring on job applications, is going to be influenced by factors that have nothing to do with merit or fit or excellence. So it's important to know that. And then again, this is not for a class, but for like something like a search committee or faculty or something like that, there is some evidence that the training can help. So making people realize their biases has some benefit. So that's kind of what I'm going to say about that. Does that make sense? Anybody wants to add anything to what that feels? I mean, I don't know if I completely skirted the question, but I mean, this is sort of some of what I thought about this.
It does occur to me that, like, I like the kind of direction of this one suggestion, but replacing diversify with modernize could have the unintended consequence of erasing all of the work of folks of color, for instance, that we're already not paying attention to, that was seminal foundational work in fields that we don't talk about that because we paid attention to the white dudes who did it or got acknowledged or got a Nobel Prize for it. But actually, these folks were the ones who did this work.
Right. No, I totally agree. And I'm not, I don't think and also, I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that by, that again, by picking only modern papers, we're going to, even if you randomly pick modern papers, you're still going to overrepresent the same. I mean, we are very far from the progress has been very slow. But at least in biology, which is kind of the only thing I know about, there has been a bit of progress in the sense that you are seeing more diverse, representations. Even if you limit yourself to, say, very high profile journals, you are more likely to see, for example, publications from non-American countries, from women scientists. But I totally agree. I don't think that's I wouldn't necessarily suggest that as a general solution. I just feel like that sometimes is a trick that you can do. And again, I would say to do it in the same way that people replace use fit or excellence in a bit of a wrong way. But I think as a part in the argument, I think that can sometimes have a bit of influence. And I've noticed it in my work as well. If I stick to the 80s in molecular biology, it's just going to be challenging it's just going to be much more challenging. And I think if I move 30 years, it still has to be an effort. And I think, again, just randomness would not do you good, but I think it just makes it much more easier, I think, to have an argument in that. But I'm not trying to suggest that there's been no contributions in back then. That's definitely the case. Yeah.
So kind of for the students who ask the question, like, out of the motivation of, I have noticed a lack of diverse representation in my curriculum, in the readings being selected, in guest speakers invited to my department, and I want to bring it up. So as a faculty member who has thought about this and is doing some work, what might that conversation look like with you? So if a student came to you and said, hey, Dr. Rog, your class is really great. It's really interesting. I'm learning a whole bunch of stuff. But I have noticed whole population missing from your reading list. Like, how would that back and forth conversation go with you as a faculty member who is already invested in this project?
Yeah, interesting. So how would that conversation go? So I'll probably start by agreeing with you, which I think a lot of people will. I think you'll be surprised how many people will. what I'll do next, again, is the part I don't know if I'm proud of less of, is I think I'm probably gonna try to put the burden on you to solve it, in the sense that I would say, like, what do you want me to do? Sort of like how, like, again, like, how do you have any specific suggestion? And I think that's an unfair request, just because, you know, you are new to the field, you wouldn't know. Anyway, so this is I think how I think the conversation might be, and the same go for seminar speakers. For example, you're going to say, okay, you know, we send a call to the department, we placed a job ad, and we didn't get any applicants of color, for example. And that would be typical in biology, just so you, I mean, you know, you can publicize a job in the school, we'd get 200-300 applicants, there'll be none of them will be, for example, an African-American. That's a reality. That's not a, you're going to do that, you're going to get, I don't know, 20% women applicants on that job search. That's, these are not made up numbers. So yeah, so I think that's how it will go. I would basically share with you my sense of inability to change. I think that's I think how the conversation is going to go. So people are going to say, great, you know, give me a name, give me a paper, I'll see what I can do. And if you can come up with a name or a paper, there is a high chance something is actually going to happen. But I think asking the faculty a general comment about diversifying might end up encountering a bit of a wall of effort, or yeah, that's my honest answer. Does that answer your question? It's an honest answer, but and I would say another version, last sentence on this, I would say that people are talking about how it simply is more work, and it's a work that nobody is compensating people for, in a deeper way. I mean, you're not for example, it would take me another, I don't know, hundreds hours of research and preparation to, you know, replace a couple of the papers with more, like, to find them and work it into my syllabus. And this goes in every stage. And I think until the system really start to compensate or prioritize this, like right now, the priority is for me to publish more papers. So that's the reality. So, or to get, you know, good teaching evaluations. I mean, these are like the metrics rather than the diversity of the curriculum. So I think it's just a challenge. But I mean, this is a very poor excuse. So did I answer your question? Yeah,
I think so. And I think when I was thinking about adding this kind of topic to the education series, I saw the kind of responses that you have indicated. I'm very grateful for you being willing to facilitate this session. Not many people are. And so I like that kind of responses that you kind of gestured at are the kind of responses I see even for this kind of session. And I think it's helpful for students to know what kind of responses they're likely to get and how to navigate those responses.
Right. Yeah,
and
so
we talk about it all the time, right? Like the change has to come from the leadership. And so we really do have to have institutional support for individual faculty to be able to do the work to expand the curriculum and expand the reading list and expand invited.
I mean, yes, I would agree. I mean, I think I've, you know, I mean, that's true. Although, I mean, that's true, but I would say that the administration, especially in our university, just because it's a public university and it's a big portion of its funds are coming from the state, is susceptible to public opinion. So I think I mean, it's not a very linear relationship, but I think if I'm saying is that as students, you are stakeholders in multiple ways. So as you're of course students, but you're also, many of you are citizens and taxpayers and voters. who basically makes this endeavor possible, and you have a way of shaping what it prioritizes. And right now, diversity isn't really one of the things the school truly prioritizing in the way it allocates funds. So that's a reality, and it's a long process, but I think there's multiple points of intervention, as you said. But definitely institutionally, there's very limited real support for this. All right. All right. So the second, this came, I think, a couple of times, and how, as a student, sort of how are you, what are some advice about how to deal with this necessity to interact with oppressive material? So, and I think this is exactly the comment I was just saying. I think it's almost like an ideological, I would say, choice in your life about how you're going to make change and how you're going to affect change. And like sort of where I'm going with this is that I think you can, the academia is very hierarchical. Is this what I have next? I guess this is what I have next. So this is I stole also from somebody else, but the idea is that your institutional power as an undergraduate student is limited, and your ability to affect change, for example, if you go out to become a graduate student or faculty or senior faculty or part of the administration, is going to be much greater. And I think there's just, because I think change is going to require so many different agents, you at some level you have to choose how much of you believe in the system to change it from within, and therefore, you know, deal with some of these materials and sort of work yourself through them in order to move up in the system and change it from within, or you can choose to fight it from the outside. And I don't think this is always mutually exclusive, but as I mentioned, standing in the steps of the Capitol and requiring, like, preventing, you know, suggesting to take funds from the university for until it you know, really puts some emphasis on increasing diversity, you know, it's probably not an option that's open to me, considering my level in the administration, but it might be open, you know, to somebody else. So I think you can have multiple ways to affect change, and seeing it as a sort of a long, even for me right now, you know, I can raise hell as a non-tenured professor, and you know, I might get some stuff done, and I might not get tenure, and I can choose to, you know, raise less hell right now, and perhaps, you know, have more power to affect more change in the future. And I'm not trying to argue for one versus the other, but I'm just trying to see a slightly longer view here, which is not, it's not a call for inaction, but it's sometimes a call for delayed action, and managing your action with your actual power in the system. So so that's not a problematic answer, but that's what I would say. The other sort of small thing I would say, I have recon here, and I think part of the strategy, and that would be, maybe I would say this is slightly more, but even in my undergraduate class and in the writing class, I feel that you sort of want to, even if you disagree with the power structure, that you know, elevated some of these pieces of science into a particular point of influence. Even if you disagree with it, there is value in knowing it and knowing how it works and knowing how power works. So so I think, yeah, I think there is a real power in teaching people to write conventionally accepted grants and papers, even if that structure is arbitrary and it carries on some structures of power that you want to resist. I just think there is value in understanding, how people wielded and crafted their power. So learning how to communicate in a way that's right now being considered good, or that is conventional, has a lot of power. So I think you do want to know your enemy and to understand, the knowledge and the structure of knowledge, even if it's faulty in many ways. So so maybe I would say that's how I would slightly maybe flip that question sometimes. So sometimes it might be worth to sit with that difficulty in order to, in the future, affect change more, more effectively. Any questions on this? All right, I'll move on. So I guess there was a question of how to find other sources of knowledge if they're so overlooked. And I think that's, again, I alluded to that a bit, in the sense that, yeah, I mean, if you ask somebody to diversify the curriculum and they ask you, okay, so how, sort of where to start from when you are in a position of power and knowledge that puts you at a disadvantage. So I guess it doesn't, and you don't need to say that, but it's obvious here. It's very hierarchical, academia, and that's one of the principle. That's one of the principles it's organized around. It's true in multiple levels. So it's definitely apparent in undergraduate versus professor situation, but it keeps on going. As I mentioned, there is the sort of senior author or the lab head versus the trainee that does the work. That hierarchy sustains itself for a long time, and that's a big deal. The one thing I would say is that you are in a point in time where I think there are competing structures to academia. So it's not the only, academia is not the sole authority on, again, I'm talking about scientific knowledge, but I'm sure it's true in other fields. And for example, in biology, this is very strong, where we're in a point where it's not like a lot of the very fundamental research is actually done outside academia, and big companies stepped into, like Google was probably the most famous one, who put a lot of money and hires a lot of people, and of course biotech is also true, and pharma, and again, these systems are far from simple or better. In many ways they aren't, but I think academia is under threat. So its power, as an institutional power, is under threat. And I think it's good to remember that and use that. This is like a classic example of where I think a lot of the power struggle lies right now, involves scientific publishing, where I think the journals, sort of big journals that ended up wielding a lot of power. Again, me choosing papers for the syllabus is really takes a lot of this authority and these decisions from which paper were decided to be published, which is not a completely independent. Of course, some of the same people who made these decisions are the people sitting in academia, but it's also not exactly the same structure. It's slightly different, and it's not equivalent. And maybe I would say the most modern part of it is like, social media. In science, I think it's mostly Twitter. I don't know about other fields, and that's been an interesting journey, I think, for everybody. And again, it's not like the power structure in Twitter is perfect, and it's not like it lacks power structure. There's very clear power structure there, but I think it's interesting because it doesn't fully overlap with the power structure inside academia. So there's some people who are very strong in one, or very strong in the other, or very strong in both, but there's some places where there's no overlap. So I would say one good place to start is social media. I mean, if you're interested in criticism, for example, it's just a story from a senior faculty in our department, and he gave a talk focusing on class, one of the true big figures in genetics and and statistics, who really, I mean, so the work was about this person's work and how it's relevant for the scientists who presented their own research. And then afterward, because of Twitter, there was been a huge discussion about how that particular person was definitely one of the fathers and supporters of eugenics in the US. And this fact would have probably been hard to come by if it wasn't for social media, at least for me personally. So that discussion for me has been informed by social media. So I think that's a pretty good place to start. To get some info. Any questions, additions of that?
Twitter is a powerful tool in my arena as well. I work in education outside of my job in the Office of Undergraduate Research too, and the critique is strong and rich on Twitter, and I appreciate being exactly stuff I would never have seen or thought of on my own.
So am I. And again, I think nowadays it reached power, and I think there's been some internal criticism of whatever particular power structure that are formed there that many times recapitulate or recreate or create a power structure that has a lot of unfair things in it. But I do think that for in a very at least some access to information type way, it can give you a big advantage in a way that, again, imagine yourself without social media, imagine yourself without the internet, having to fight those fights. So I think we are in a position to fight those fights way better than we were a few decades ago. So again, not far from a solution, but it's something. What else do I have? Okay, mentorship. So how Black person of color, marginalized student find high quality supportive mentorship or role model. Yeah, so that's rough. And as I said here, that's a big problem. And I mean, I'm sure you probably noticed, this is not like a secret, but we are doing very poorly. As I mentioned, some of the stats on job applications, school biological science, we're about 50 faculty. There isn't a single African American. We now hired a couple of people, I think, who are Latinos as faculty. This happened in the last 2 or 3 years, so there were none until 2 or 3 years ago. I'm the first out gay tenured track faculty in the College of Science. I think it's all its history. And then again, this is not, as I mentioned, as EU, but I don't think this is much better, for example, in the subfield and parts of, say, like chromosome biology, molecular biology, meiosis, like things I've mentioned. None of them is doing better at all. You know, we are at about I think it's jokes like that, but this is a reality. I think now with the retirements, I think there were times in the last few years where there were more people named David than women faculty in our department. That's not a joke. These are facts. And again, this is despite years of like pipeline, you know, women PhD students have come for decades, have either been equal or outnumbered male PhD students in the West and in the US. And that translated to very slow and in some places, you know, aborted progress in representation of women in tenure track or tenured faculty positions. So this is a big problem. And this is like, again, one of the ones we're really trying to deal with. But as I mentioned, happy to talk about that. This is like definitely ongoing discussions, and it starts in many as I mentioned, I focused personally on a lot of graduate education because I felt that's where I can make some impact, but it's an issue. What I would say is that this is a general advice, not necessarily about diversity, but I think I would recommend to not limit yourself to looking for mentorship in people who perhaps match some specific, you know, criteria that maybe you're looking for. So I don't maybe I'll talk personal experience. I don't think the best mentorship I got as a gay person was from other gay faculty. So, and I think the fact that somebody might have been gay does not necessarily would have predicted their ability to be a mentor for me. And so I think that does not absolve us from problem number one, and this is not a solution to that. But if as a student or as, again, moving up in the ladder, you need mentorship in along every step of the way. I think there's title and prestige and other kind of external attributes, even the fact that particular person might have helped somebody else who was, perhaps suffered from the same axis of discrimination as you, that does not necessarily mean they're going to be able or will help you or give you what you want or what you need to really thrive. So I think I would definitely still, even in a very, hierarchical and structured system, I guess my personal belief is that people are still very important, and human, personal interaction is still crucial. So I would say, don't go anywhere where your gut instincts tells you that's bad for you, even if on paper that person seems to be, perfect for you or matches, again, a particular set of attributes that you feel is what you imagine would help you or what you are dealing with. That does not necessarily mean that this is going to be good for you, and vice versa. I think sometimes you'll find somebody who's a good, can supply supportive environment, even if on paper they really share very little with you as far as their biography is concerned. So I would say that along every step of your way. I feel like we're just social creatures, and we're pretty good about, I think when we trust our actual instincts, I don't think they're that bad. And I think sometimes they're just being overweight by different ideas we have about prestige and titles and yeah. So anyhow, that's personal opinion, but that's how I conducted my life. So that's kind of how I went every step of the way. So I'm happy with it. So